You are watching a master at work. Bruce Lee, 5 feet 7.5 inches tall, 135 pounds of martial art dynamite. Hong Kong in February of 1973 is a bustling island of modern industry and commerce that plays against a backdrop of culture and tradition that's remained largely unchanged for over 1,000 years. The biggest news coming from within the city these days is the rapid growth of its motion picture industry. Formerly an enterprise of no consequence to anyone but local theater owners, the Hong Kong movie industry is now attracting the attention of the most powerful film studios in the world. The reason for this sudden surge in interest is the meteoric rise to fame within the city of a 32-year-old man named Bruce Lee. Lee's dynamic on-screen presence, coupled with an audience empathy that cuts across all cultural boundaries, have resulted in his films shattering box office records. Producers the world over have come to see in Lee the key that will unlock the door to the future of the industry. They begin to flood the young artist with offers that even a year ago would have been impossible for him to have imagined. After years of battling against cultural and professional bigotry, economic and emotional hardship, as well as the exhausting effort required to sustain the integrity of his art, Lee's perseverance has finally been rewarded. He has become the most sought-after motion picture actor in the world. With such power now at his disposal, Lee could easily choose to rest on his laurels and play it safe by making the kind of formula pictures that are now being offered him on a daily basis. But the very notion of formulas and methods hold no appeal whatsoever for this young man. Instead, Lee is presently in the midst of filming The Game of Death, what he terms a multi-level film, in which his personal philosophy of martial art is being presented for the first time. He's returning to this film after a brief hiatus, having spent the fall of the previous year filming 3 sequences, the finale, it turns out, of the film. Lee performs the work and assumes the responsibility of 8 people in the creation of this film. He's the director, the producer, the choreographer, the author of the screenplay, in addition to having a hand in set design, the cinematography, and the lighting of the film. And of course, he's the leading actor. Martial artists who are not accustomed to the camera must be taught how to sell a strike or a reaction for optimal dramatic effect. Again, this falls to Lee to look after. Take after take of precision martial art choreography is performed. Lee will spend, in some instances, up to 4 days filming what will turn out to be only a 5-minute fight sequence. Lee is most demanding of himself. In this shot, involving his handling a nunchaku, an ancient oriental weapon that was originally used as a rice flail, Lee will shoot no less than 10 takes to capture one small sequence that will appear on screen for a mere 3.5 seconds. He wants his films to have the stamp of realism and believability. Filming of The Game of Death is suspended in October of 1972 when word reaches the set that Warner Brothers is now interested in co-producing his next film. It will mark the first time in the history of East-West relations that a Chinese and American film studio work together on a motion picture. Lee views the co-production as a step toward raising global understanding of Chinese culture and of having Chinese films accepted into the international market.
Did you look at many Mandarin movies before you started playing in the first one?
Yes.
What did you think of them when you saw them?
Quality-wise, I mean, I have to admit that it's not quite up to the standard. However, it is growing, and it is getting higher and higher and going toward that standard, that what I would term quality.
Lee and his business partner, Raymond Chow, fly to Los Angeles in November of 1972 to complete negotiations with Warner Brothers for what will prove to be Lee's last and biggest film, Enter the Dragon. January to April of 1973, Lee gives over to the filming of Enter the Dragon. Again, he will oversee every aspect of its production and post-production. By the time his schedule allows him to resume working on additional ideas for The Game of Death, it's mid-July of 1973, the final week of his life. July 20th, his last day on Earth, he will spend discussing script ideas for the film. On this fateful day, Lee will, in characteristic optimism, look ahead to September 20th, 1973. He will write in his daytime diary for this date of his intention to resume filming The Game of Death. These will prove to be the last words he will ever write. Lee's passing hits the residents of Hong Kong like a tidal wave. Disbelief, shock, anger. There was so much more the young man had to accomplish, so much he had to live for, and now, nothing. Upon Lee's passing, so too passes the movement toward realism in Eastern cinema that he had pioneered. Almost immediately, action films will revert to being unbelievable and hokey. Ironically, during an audio dictation that Lee makes only weeks prior to his passing, he comments on this very distinction between his films and those made by other, less dedicated production companies.
I can tell you that as more Bruce Lee's films are shown, the audience will soon realize not only in acting ability, but in physical skill as well, they will see the difference.
5 years after his passing, excerpts from the film that Lee had worked so feverishly on during the final months and hours of his life are edited into a film featuring Lee's title, Game of Death. But the film bears no comparison to Lee's original multi-level vision. Without Lee's choreography notes, script outline, and motif, the producers are uncertain what to do with the 100 minutes of footage they have in their possession. Moreover, they discover that Lee was such a perfectionist that of the 100 minutes of footage they have in hand, 2/3 turn out to be outtakes and retakes, shots that Lee himself had discarded for sequences in the film that he felt were beneath his standard of quality. They deem only 11 minutes and 7 seconds of the footage to be worthy of inclusion in their film. The rest, approximately 21 minutes worth, they discard. Intercutting actual footage of Lee into fight sequences involving lookalikes and even using cardboard cutouts of Lee's head, the end result is viewed by many as an exploitive and grotesque joke played on the great artist's legacy. By now, even Lee's most zealous fans are beginning to believe that the original footage is gone and that it will never be possible to see the footage Lee shot in its entirety, nor to ever learn what his original storyline for the film was. In the fall of 1994, during research conducted for a multi-volume book series based on Lee's surviving writings, Lee's original script and choreography writings for The Game of Death are recovered. The writings confirm what had long been suspected, that Lee had indeed shot considerably more footage for The Game of Death than had been seen to date. Another unexpected surprise is discovered in among his choreography writings, his handwritten storyline. 12 pages in length, and containing all scene breakdowns and select dialogue passages, the original storyline stands in sharp contrast to the one presented in the film released under the same name. After the discovery of Lee's script notes, a search to find the missing footage is launched. It will last some 6 years. But then, the miraculous happens. The original 35mm film footage is located. After having been separated for over 1/4 of a century, Bruce Lee's original footage and script notes are finally reunited. Over the course of this film, you'll see this footage as Bruce Lee had intended for it to be shown, and you'll also come to understand the struggle he had to undergo in order to bring it to the big screen. And perhaps along the way, you'll come to know the real Bruce Lee, the man behind the legend, a little better as well.
Water is the softest substance in the world, but yet it can penetrate the hardest rock or anything, granite, you name it. Water also is insubstantial. By that I mean you cannot grasp hold of it. You cannot punch it and hurt it. So every Kung Fu man is trying to do that, to be soft like water and flexible and adapt itself to the opponent.
It is February of 1965 in Los Angeles, California, where a 24-year-old Bruce Lee is in the midst of auditioning for a TV series that will never be made. In 19 months, he will be known to American audiences as Kato from The Green Hornet. In 5 years, he'll discover a truth that will forever alter the course of martial art history. And in 8 years, he'll be the most famous motion picture actor in the world. But that's all in the future. Today, he's unknown.
And you went to college in the United States?
Yes.
And what did you study?
Philosophy.
Bruce Lee's interest in philosophy, defined by the Western ethos as the love of wisdom, is a passion that will remain with him throughout the remainder of his life. Lee has been teaching Americans about Chinese philosophy and culture for 6 years, lecturing in the Pacific Northwest on the subtleties of Chinese thought. His great passion, however, is Kung Fu, an ancient Chinese fighting art, unknown in the America of 1965. Lee's scrapbook from this period of his life reveals brief descriptions of many of the arts and traditions of the venerated masters of Kung Fu. America's only knowledge of the martial arts in 1965 are by way of judo and jiu-jitsu, 2 Japanese arts that were taught to her servicemen during the Korean War. Lee regards himself as an ambassador for Chinese martial art, teaching all who will listen about the ways of the Chinese masters.
Now, you told me earlier today that karate and jiu-jitsu are not the most powerful of the best forms of Oriental fighting. What is the most powerful of the best form?
Well, it's bad to say the best, but in my opinion, I think Kung Fu is pretty good.
Will you tell us a little bit about Kung Fu?
Well, Kung Fu is originated in China. It is the ancestor of karate and jiu-jitsu. It's more of a complete system, and it's more fluid. By that I mean it's more flowing. There is continuity in movement instead of 1 movement, 2 movement, and then stop.
I see. What's the difference between a Kung Fu punch and a karate punch?
Well, a karate punch is like an iron bar, whang. A Kung Fu punch is like an iron chain with an iron ball attached to the end, and it go whang, and it hurt inside.
Okay.
Lee has studied a system of Chinese Kung Fu for the past 9 years called Wing Chun, and is considered one of the art's most talented and articulate exponents. His teacher in this art has been an elderly Hong Kong Chinese master by the name of Yip Man. Despite his proficiency in this style of Kung Fu, his study of philosophy has caused him to question. And now he begins to question why most martial artists, Chinese and otherwise, seem more concerned with preserving tradition than with looking more deeply into the matter to penetrate through to the ultimate truth of martial art. Moreover, Lee has begun to develop his own method of Kung Fu, which he describes as non-classical in nature and which takes as its core the principles of economy of motion, simplicity, and directness.
All right, for instance, you will read it in a book, in a magazine and everything, that when somebody grabs you, You will first do this, and then this, and then, thousands of steps before you do a single thing. Of course, these kind of magazine would teach you to be feared by your enemies and admired by your friends and everything. But in Kung Fu, it always involves a very fast motion. Like, for instance, a guy grabbing your hand. It's not the idea to do so many steps. Step him right on the instep. He'll let go. This is what we mean by simplicity. Same thing in striking and in everything. It has to be based on a very minimum motion so that everything would be directly expressed. One motion, and he's gone. Doing it gracefully, not to go, yelling and jumping all over him, but to do Excuse me.
Both the American and Chinese martial art communities resent his iconoclasm. For such a young man to stand up against thousands of years of tradition and venerated authority is considered a direct threat to the status quo and its entrenched power base.
Prior to Bruce's coming to this country, you know, Kung Fu was alive in most all the Chinese communities, but there was nothing taught to outsiders, basically. And Bruce came along, and with that basis of trying to create equality amongst all people, regardless of race, he chose to, you know, to let anybody into his school, regardless of what color or race they were, as long as he knew what was in their heart was good and positive. Why he took them in, and like when he was down in San Francisco, where the Chinese community was much more like being in China, they took exception to it, and he had to fight his way out of it.
In Oakland, he received a challenge from the San Francisco Chinese martial arts community, and the challenge read that Bruce, if he were to be defeated in this challenge, would have to cease teaching Caucasian or non-Chinese students. And the Chinese martial artist came over from San Francisco to Bruce's studio in Oakland, and a very formal challenge took place. I was present there. In fact, I was 8 months pregnant with Brandon, and James Lee was there. And this fight with this Chinese martial artist lasted about 3 minutes. It consisted of a lot of running, where the Chinese martial artist took off and started running around the room, and Bruce was pursuing him before Bruce finally got a hold of him and took him down to the floor and made him give up. And after the challenge ended with the Chinese martial artist being soundly defeated and they all went away, Bruce won the right to teach anyone he wanted to.
By February of 1967, Lee has 3 schools operating in Seattle, Oakland, and Los Angeles that teach his own interpretation of Kung Fu, based on his own investigations into the ultimate truth of unarmed combat. However, by now the young man is openly critical of the traditions and limitations he sees as inherent in the martial arts as they're currently being practiced in America. He believes they lack a solid grounding in reality, consisting of rehearsed self-defense routines that are employed in predictable and patternized rhythms. He notes that real combat is spontaneous, not rehearsed, and is made up of irregular or broken rhythm that a martial artist cannot anticipate, only respond to. Even the championship karate tournaments of the era are non-contact affairs, settled not on knockouts, but on an accumulation of points awarded for blows that never touch an opponent. A victory is determined by a team of judges who conclude which combatant would probably have hurt the other combatant the most had contact been allowed. Lee has no use for such styles of pseudo-fighting, which he calls organized despair and dry land swimming. Lee's criticism of the arts can be attributed in part to his background in Hong Kong, which consisted not of non-contact karate tournaments, but full-contact street fights and challenge matches fought on Hong Kong rooftops. When not fighting against proponents of different styles of Kung Fu on rooftops, Lee had also fought frequently against opponents who had been armed with knives and chains. In such real-world encounters, referees and judges were not necessary. Rather than participating in non-contact karate tournaments, which he considers little more than glorified games of tag, Lee instead devotes himself to devising a more scientific approach to unarmed combat. His research leads him to the science of Newtonian physics and the techniques and principles of European fencing and Western boxing, where efficiency, not tradition, are the touchstones of both disciplines. Lee's research causes him to understand that the only litmus test of a combative technique's worth is whether or not it can be landed effectively on an opponent. Anything that's ornamental is discarded from his style. He retains only those techniques that he himself has determined to be practical in real self-defense situations. Lee is the first martial artist in North America, if not the world, to have his students don boxing gloves, headgear, and body protectors and spar all out. Nothing is rehearsed, no punches are pulled, and full contact, reality-based martial art is the order of the day. In 1967, Lee introduces the concept of full contact sparring at the International Karate Tournament in Long Beach, California. Defense is not emphasized in his new reality-based method, as this would be allowing one's opponent to set the tone and tempo in a real fight. Instead, the focus of Lee's new approach to combat is on attack, or more precisely, on interception.